In the twilight hours of the Bronze Age, when the Mediterranean world pulsed with the rhythms of trade and conquest, great cities rose like jewels from the coastal plains. Troy stood proudest among them, its mighty walls catching the first light of dawn as ships from distant lands brought precious cargo to its harbours. The archaeological layers of Hisarlik in modern Turkey whisper of this ancient grandeur, where real kings once ruled and real warriors walked streets that would become legend. As you settle into comfort, let the mists of time carry you back to an age when gods walked among mortals and the fate of nations hung upon the choices of a few remarkable souls. The story begins not with war, but with a wedding that would shake the very foundations of the world. Peleus, a mortal king of the Myrmidons, had won the heart of Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty was matched only by her divine power. Their union was blessed by Zeus himself, for a prophecy had foretold that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. To prevent any threat to his own supremacy, the king of the gods arranged her marriage to a mortal, ensuring that her child, though mighty, would remain bound by human limitations. All the gods were invited to this celestial celebration, save one. Eris, the goddess of discord, had been deliberately excluded from the guest list, her chaotic nature deemed too dangerous for such a joyous occasion. Yet exclusion only fed her appetite for mischief. As the divine guests feasted and celebrated, Eris appeared uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with a single word, "For the fairest." She cast this prize among the assembled goddesses and vanished, leaving behind a seed of vanity that would bloom into catastrophe. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple as rightfully theirs. Hera, queen of the gods and wife of Zeus, radiated the majestic beauty of sovereignty. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, possessed an austere perfection that reflected her divine intellect. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, embodied the very essence of physical allure. Each was convinced of her own supremacy, and none would yield to the others. The wedding celebration dissolved into acrimonious debate, with the divine guests taking sides and the very air crackling with immortal tension. Zeus, faced with this impossible choice and unwilling to risk the wrath of any of these powerful goddesses, devised a solution that would remove the burden from divine shoulders. He declared that the matter should be decided by a mortal, one whose judgment would be accepted as impartial, precisely because he stood outside the celestial hierarchy. The chosen judge would be Paris, a prince of Troy who was renowned for his fairness and his eye for beauty. What the gods did not know was that this decision would set in motion events that would reshape the ancient world. Paris had been born Alexander to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, but his path to the throne had been marked by prophecy and abandonment. Before his birth, Hecuba had dreamed of giving birth to a flaming torch that would consume all of Troy, and the royal soothsayers interpreted this as an omen of disaster. When the child was born, Priam could not bring himself to kill his own son, but neither could he ignore the prophecy. Instead, he ordered that the infant be exposed on the slopes of Mount Ida, leaving his fate to the gods and the elements. The child did not perish as expected. He was found and raised by shepherds, growing to manhood among the flocks on the mountainside, unaware of his royal heritage. He lived a simple life, falling in love with a nymph named Oenone who possessed the gift of healing. Their romance bloomed in the pastoral setting of the mountain slopes, where Paris learned the ways of nature and developed the keen eye for beauty and justice that would later recommend him to the gods. As you rest in peaceful darkness, imagine the gentle sounds of this mountain idyll, where a prince unknowingly prepared for a judgment that would echo through eternity. When Hermes, messenger of the gods, appeared before Paris with the 3 goddesses and their challenge, the shepherd prince faced a choice that no mortal should have to make. Each goddess offered him a bribe to secure his favourable judgment. Hera promised him dominion over all of Asia and Europe, the power to rule vast empires and command the loyalty of countless subjects. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in all battles, the skill to become the greatest warrior and strategist the world had ever known. But Aphrodite's offer spoke to something deeper in his heart. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, young and romantic, perhaps thinking of his simple love for Oenone, chose Aphrodite and awarded her the golden apple. In that moment, he gained a divine ally, but made two immortal enemies. Hera and Athena departed in fury. Their rage focused not only on Paris, but on his beloved city of Troy. The shepherd prince had no way of knowing that his choice would doom his homeland, for Aphrodite's promised reward came with a price that would stagger the imagination. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus, and the mortal woman, Leda. Her divine parentage had blessed her with such extraordinary beauty that she had become the most sought-after bride in all of Greece. When she came of age, suitors flocked to the court of her earthly father, Tyndareus of Sparta, from every corner of the Greek world. Kings and princes, heroes and warriors, all vied for her hand, their rivalry threatening to tear Greece apart in civil war. Tyndareus, wise in the ways of politics, devised a solution that would bind all of Helen's suitors in common cause. Before announcing his choice of husband, he required every suitor to swear a sacred oath. They would accept his decision without complaint, and more importantly, they would come to the aid of Helen's chosen husband should anyone ever attempt to steal her away or do her harm. This oath, sworn before the gods with solemn ritual, created an alliance that encompassed virtually every major kingdom in Greece. The chosen husband was Menelaus, brother of the mighty Agamemnon, who ruled Mycenae. While not the most illustrious of the suitors, Menelaus possessed the political backing and military strength that Tyndareus deemed most valuable for his daughter's protection. Helen became queen of Sparta, and for several years she lived in apparent contentment with her husband, bearing him a daughter named Hermione. The marriage seemed blessed, a peaceful union between two of Greece's most powerful royal houses. Meanwhile, in Troy, Paris had learned of his true identity and been welcomed back to the royal court by his father Priam. The prophecy of his birth had been forgotten or dismissed, and the young prince quickly established himself as one of the brightest stars of Trojan nobility. He was handsome, charming, and skilled in all the arts befitting a prince, though he showed little inclination toward the martial pursuits that occupied most of his brothers. Instead, Paris excelled in diplomacy and culture, making him an ideal choice for missions requiring tact and refinement. It was in this capacity that Paris was sent to Sparta as an ambassador, tasked with negotiating trade agreements and strengthening the bonds between Troy and the Greek kingdoms. He arrived at Menelaus's court, bearing rich gifts and speaking words of friendship, unaware that Aphrodite was already weaving her spell around both him and Helen. From the moment their eyes met, divine madness took hold of both hearts, a passion so overwhelming that all other considerations fell away like autumn leaves. Helen's transformation from dutiful wife to passionate lover unfolded like a dream within a dream. The goddess of love had fulfilled her promise to Paris, but at a cost that neither mortal could comprehend in their ecstasy. While Menelaus was away attending to affairs of state, Helen abandoned her home, her daughter, and her sacred marriage bonds to flee with Paris across the wine-dark sea to Troy. Behind them, they left a kingdom in turmoil and a husband whose honor had been shattered before the eyes of the world. The news of Helen's flight spread across Greece like wildfire, carrying with it the weight of sacred oaths and wounded pride. Menelaus, returning to find his palace empty and his marriage bed cold, felt his world crumble beneath him. But his personal anguish was quickly subsumed into a larger political crisis, for Helen's abduction threatened the entire balance of power in the Greek world. The oath sworn by her former suitors now came due, and one by one, the kings and princes of Greece received Menelaus's call to arms. Agamemnon, the most powerful of the Greek kings, saw in his brother's crisis an opportunity to unite the fractious Greek kingdoms under his leadership and extend his influence beyond the mainland. He took command of the growing coalition, using a combination of duty, honor, and political pressure to assemble what would become the greatest military expedition the world had ever seen. From Mycenae and Sparta, from Pylos and Crete, from Ithaca and Salamis, the heroes of Greece began to gather, each bringing ships and men to the common cause. As you drift deeper into the peaceful realm of sleep, let your mind wander to the harbours of Bronze Age Greece, where carpenters worked by torchlight to prepare the great ships that would carry this army across the sea. The scent of pine pitch and cedar shavings filled the air as hulls were sealed and sails were woven, while smiths hammered bronze into spearheads and shield bosses that gleamed in the firelight. Every kingdom contributed according to its means and abilities, creating a vast network of supply and support that stretched across the Greek world. Not all of the great heroes answered the call willingly. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, had received a prophecy that if he went to Troy, he would not return home for 20 years. When Agamemnon's messengers arrived at his island kingdom, they found him ploughing his fields with salt, pretending to be mad in hopes of avoiding the expedition. But his ruse was discovered when they placed his infant son Telemachus in front of his plough, and Odysseus's paternal instincts overcame his deception. Unable to maintain the pretense, he acknowledged his sanity and reluctantly agreed to join the expedition. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, was hidden away by his mother Thetis, who knew from prophecy that he would die young if he went to Troy. She disguised him as a woman and hid him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Scyros. But Odysseus, tasked with finding the young hero, arrived at Lycomedes' court disguised as a merchant. Among his wares, he included weapons alongside jewelry and fine cloth. When Achilles instinctively reached for a sword instead of silk, his identity was revealed, and another piece fell into place for the great expedition. The gathering of this mighty host took time, and as months passed, the political and logistical challenges of maintaining such a coalition began to test even Agamemnon's considerable skills. Kings who had sworn sacred oaths still needed to be convinced, supplied and coordinated. Ships had to be built or requisitioned, provisions gathered, and routes planned. The scale of the undertaking dwarfed anything previously attempted in the Greek world, requiring innovations in organization and supply that would influence military thinking for generations to come. While the Greeks prepared their expedition, Troy was not idle. Priam and his counselors understood that Helen's presence in their city had created a crisis that could not be resolved through diplomacy alone. The Trojan king was torn between love for his son Paris and the growing realization that keeping Helen might cost his city everything it had built over centuries of prosperity. Yet to return her now would be to admit wrongdoing and invite further Greek demands, potentially including the surrender of Paris himself to face Menelaus's justice. Troy's response was to prepare for siege while simultaneously seeking allies among the kingdoms and tribes of Asia Minor and beyond. The city's wealth and trading relationships provided a foundation for building a defensive coalition, and messengers were dispatched to courts from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt, seeking military support and pledging mutual assistance. The great city, that had prospered through commerce, now marshalled its resources for war, its markets filling with weapons instead of luxury goods. The city itself underwent transformation as well. Troy's famous walls, already formidable, were strengthened and extended. New towers rose to overlook the approaches from the sea, while cisterns and granaries were expanded to withstand a lengthy siege. The civilian population swelled as refugees from the surrounding countryside sought protection within the city's embrace, bringing with them herds and portable wealth that would help sustain the defense. As the night deepens around you, picture these ancient preparations, the steady rhythm of hammer on anvil and stone on stone as a civilization prepared to defend its very existence. When spring arrived and the sailing season opened, the Greek fleet finally assembled at Aulis, a harbour on the coast of Boeotia. The sight that greeted observers there must have been breathtaking in its scope and grandeur. Over 1,000 ships of various sizes rode at anchor, their bronze-reinforced prows catching the sunlight like scales on some great sea serpent. The beach camps stretched for miles along the shore, organised by kingdom and clan, with the smoke of countless cooking fires rising into the clear spring air. But divine forces were not finished complicating mortal plans. As the fleet prepared to depart, the winds died completely, leaving the ships becalmed in waters smooth as polished bronze. Day after day passed without the slightest breeze to fill their sails, and the expeditionary force found itself trapped in harbour, while supplies dwindled and morale began to suffer. The seer Calchas consulted about this ominous delay, delivered prophecy that struck like lightning through the assembled kings. Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, had been offended by Agamemnon's boastful claim that he was a better hunter than she. The goddess had stilled the winds and would not release them until the Greek commander offered a sacrifice worthy of appeasing her wounded pride. That sacrifice, Calchas declared with terrible certainty, must be Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter, offered upon the altar with all the ceremony due to the immortal gods. The demand created a crisis that threatened to destroy the expedition before it could begin. Agamemnon faced an impossible choice between his duty as a father and his obligations as commander of the Greek forces. To sacrifice his daughter would stain his soul with the blackest guilt, but to refuse would doom the expedition and dishonour the sacred oaths that bound the coalition together. The other kings watched and waited, some supporting his anguish, others calculating the political advantages that might flow from his downfall. In the end, Agamemnon chose the expedition over his daughter, sending word to his wife Clytemnestra that Iphigenia should come to Aulis to be married to Achilles. The deception worked, and mother and daughter arrived at the harbour full of joy for what they believed would be a wedding celebration. Only when it was too late to escape did they learn the true purpose of their journey, and Iphigenia's cries of betrayal and terror echoed across the camp as she was led to the sacrificial altar. The sacrifice of Iphigenia created a wound in the Greek coalition that would never fully heal. Clytemnestra returned to Mycenae, carrying a burden of grief and rage that would fester for years, while Agamemnon carried the guilt of his choice like a weight upon his soul. Yet the winds rose immediately after the terrible deed was done, filling the sails of the waiting fleet and carrying them eastward across the Aegean toward their destiny. As you rest in the gentle darkness, let the sound of those ancient winds carry away the heaviness of this tragedy, leaving only the rhythm of waves against hulls as the greatest expedition in history began its fateful journey. The voyage to Troy took the better part of a month, as such a large fleet could only move as fast as its slowest vessels. The Greek ships followed the island chains that dotted the Aegean, stopping frequently for water and supplies, while their leaders refined their plans for the coming siege. Intelligence gathered from merchants and refugees painted a picture of Troy's defences and the coalition that Priam had assembled to resist them, information that would prove crucial in the battles to come. The Trojan coalition was indeed formidable, drawing strength from across the known world. From Thrace came wild horsemen led by Rhesus, their white steeds said to be swift as the wind itself. The Lycians contributed perhaps the finest archers in the world, led by Sarpedon, a son of Zeus, who commanded both respect and fear among his allies. From the distant lands of the Amazons came warrior women whose skill with bow and spear rivaled that of any man, while from Ethiopia came dark-skinned warriors bearing shields of exotic hide and weapons of mysterious metals. Most formidable of all Troy's allies was Hector, eldest son of Priam, and the greatest warrior the city had ever produced. Where Paris embodied the cultural refinement of Troy, Hector represented its martial strength and moral authority. He had not sought this war, and indeed had counselled his father to return Helen and avoid the coming catastrophe. But once battle became inevitable, he threw himself into Troy's defence with a dedication that inspired every man who served under him. His presence on the battlefield was worth thousands of ordinary soldiers, and his leadership gave the Trojan cause a focus and determination that might otherwise have been lacking. The Greek fleet finally came within sight of Troy's walls on a morning when the sun rose red over the waters of the Hellespont, as if the sky itself was painted with the blood that would soon flow. The sight that greeted them was both magnificent and daunting. Troy rose from its hill like a crown of stone and bronze, its walls catching the early light and reflecting it back to the sea in brilliant flashes. The city's towers were black with defenders, while the harbour bristled with Trojan ships drawn up for battle. Between the Greeks and their prize lay not just physical obstacles, but the assembled might of Asia, and the will of a people fighting for their homes and freedom. The first battle came not on the beaches, but in the harbour itself, as Trojan ships sallied forth to prevent the Greek landing. Bronze-sheathed rams cut through the water like knives, while archers on both sides filled the air with arrows that fell like deadly rain. The clash of bronze on bronze echoed across the water as boarding parties fought for control of individual vessels, the sea itself turning red with the blood of warriors who would never see their homes again. It was in this first engagement that Protesilaus Achilles won immortal fame by being the first Greek to leap ashore on Trojan soil, fulfilling a prophecy that the first to land would also be the first to die. His death, coming just moments after his feet touched the beach, cast a shadow over the Greek landing, but his sacrifice had opened the way for others to follow. Wave after wave of Greek warriors poured onto the shore, their bronze weapons gleaming in the morning sun as they carved out a foothold on the Trojan coast. The establishment of the Greek camp on the shores before Troy marked the beginning of what would become the longest siege in ancient memory. The Greeks chose their position carefully, placing their ships at the water's edge where they could be easily defended and quickly launched if retreat became necessary. Behind this naval base, they constructed a fortified camp, complete with walls, towers, and gates, creating a city of their own to face the city they hoped to conquer. The physical arrangement of this camp, with each contingent occupying its own section arranged by status and alliance, reflected the complex political relationships within the Greek coalition. As the seasons turned and months stretched into years, the siege of Troy settled into a grinding routine, punctuated by moments of desperate violence. The Greeks could not simply storm Troy's walls. They were too strong and too well defended, nor could they completely cut off the city's supply lines, for Troy's allies controlled much of the surrounding territory. Instead, the war became a contest of endurance, each side seeking to exhaust the other's resources and will to fight. The daily reality of the siege involved constant skirmishing and raiding as both sides sought to gain advantage through smaller actions. Greek ships raided up and down the coast, capturing supply convoys and attacking Troy's allies in their home territories. Meanwhile, Trojan forces struck at Greek foraging parties and attempted to disrupt the supply lines that kept the besieging army fed and equipped. These smaller engagements, rarely recorded in the great songs, nonetheless cost thousands of lives and gradually wore down both armies through constant attrition. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical combat. Both sides sought to undermine enemy morale through displays of strength, challenges to single combat, and attempts to win over neutral parties or persuade allied contingents to change sides. The war of words, fought by heralds and ambassadors, was no less crucial than the clash of arms, for in an age when personal loyalty and divine favour were seen as decisive factors, maintaining the confidence of one's own forces while sowing doubt among the enemy was a strategic imperative. As you settle deeper into peaceful rest, let your mind drift to the quiet moments between battles, when warriors on both sides would tend their weapons, tell stories of home, and wonder if they would live to see another dawn. The siege created its own rhythm of life and death, hope and despair, heroism and horror that bound together Greek and Trojan alike in a shared experience of war's bitter lessons. The fourth year of the siege brought changes that would alter the character of the entire conflict. Achilles, who had been the Greeks' most effective warrior in the early fighting, became increasingly frustrated with Agamemnon's leadership and the slow progress of the war. The young hero had come to Troy seeking glory and honour, but found instead an endless grinding campaign that seemed to offer little opportunity for the kind of heroic deeds that would win immortal fame. His restlessness began to affect not only his own fighting effectiveness, but the morale of his myrmidons, the elite warriors who followed him from his home in Phthia. The tension between Achilles and Agamemnon came to a head over a seemingly minor matter involving captured prisoners and the distribution of war spoils. During one of the Greek raids on Troy's allied cities, the army had captured two women of noble birth, Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Briseis, a princess who had become Achilles' prize. When Chryseis' father came to the Greek camp bearing a rich ransom and invoking the protection of his god, Agamemnon initially refused to release her, claiming his right as commander to the finest spoils of war. Apollo's response to this insult to his priest was swift and terrible. A plague descended upon the Greek camp, striking down soldiers and camp followers alike, with a wasting disease that defied all attempts at treatment. The pyres burned day and night as the death toll mounted, and even the bravest warriors began to whisper that the gods themselves had turned against the expedition. Calchas the seer, consulted in desperation, revealed that only the return of Chryseis to her father would appease the archer god's wrath. Faced with the destruction of his army, Agamemnon had no choice but to release Chryseis, but his pride demanded compensation for the loss. Exercising his authority as supreme commander, he claimed Briseis as his replacement prize, stripping her from Achilles despite the young hero's furious objections. This act, legally within Agamemnon's rights but morally questionable, created a rift that would prove nearly fatal to the Greek cause. Achilles' withdrawal from battle came at the worst possible moment for the Greeks. Emboldened by the champion's absence and the signs of divine disfavour that had struck their enemies, the Trojans began pressing their attacks with renewed vigour. Hector, who had always been cautious about leaving Troy's protective walls, now led sorties that pushed the Greeks back toward their ships and threatened to break the siege entirely. What had been a war of attrition suddenly became a desperate struggle for survival. The battles that followed Achilles' withdrawal tested every aspect of Greek leadership and morale. Without their greatest warrior to anchor their battle line, the coalition forces found themselves constantly on the defensive, their previous confidence shattered by the reality of facing Hector and his reinvigorated army without their most powerful weapon. Individual Greek heroes stepped forward to fill the gap left by Achilles, but none possessed the combination of skill, strength, and sheer presence that had made the son of Thetis such a decisive factor in earlier engagements. Diomedes of Argos emerged as perhaps the most effective of Achilles' replacements, his courage and tactical skill earning him victories against some of Troy's finest warriors. In one legendary encounter, He even wounded Aphrodite herself when the goddess intervened to protect her son Aeneas, proving that mortal valor could sometimes triumph over divine interference. Yet for all his prowess, Diomedes lacked the almost supernatural aura that surrounded Achilles, and his victories, however impressive, could not fully compensate for the absent hero's impact on battlefield morale. The great Ajax, son of Telamon, provided the defensive strength that kept the Greek lines from collapsing entirely under Trojan pressure. His massive shield and unyielding courage made him a living wall against enemy advances, while his tactical understanding helped coordinate the defensive efforts of the various Greek contingents. But Ajax was primarily a defensive fighter, lacking the offensive capability that might have turned the tide of battle in the Greeks' favour. Odysseus contributed his own unique skills to the Greek war effort, using cunning and diplomacy where others relied on strength of arms. His ability to inspire wavering allies and devise unconventional tactics kept the coalition together during its darkest hours, while his intelligence gathering and psychological warfare helped maintain some semblance of strategic initiative. Yet even Odysseus's considerable talents could not fully replace what the Greeks had lost with Achilles' withdrawal from battle. As the siege dragged on into its 7th year, both sides began to show signs of war weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The initial enthusiasm that had driven Greek warriors to seek glory at Troy had been ground down by years of inconclusive fighting, while the Trojans found their resources stretched thin by the constant need to maintain their defences and support their allies. The war was consuming an entire generation of heroes, leaving gaps in the ranks that younger, less experienced warriors struggled to fill. The political situation within both camps became increasingly complex as the war's duration tested traditional loyalties and created new alliances based on shared hardship rather than ancient bonds. Some Greek contingents began to question whether Helen was worth the cost in blood and treasure that her recovery demanded, while certain Trojan allies wondered if their own interests might be better served by negotiating separate peace agreements with the Greeks. It was during this period of maximum strain that divine intervention took a new and more direct form. The gods themselves had become divided over the war's outcome, with Zeus attempting to maintain neutrality while other members of the Olympian pantheon chose sides and actively intervened in mortal affairs. These divine politics added another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation, as mortals found themselves caught between competing celestial loyalties that could override their earthly allegiances. Hera and Athena, still nursing their grudges from the judgment of Paris, threw their support behind the Greeks, using their considerable powers to aid the coalition whenever possible. Aphrodite naturally supported Troy and her beloved Paris, while Apollo and Artemis also favoured the Trojans for various divine reasons. Poseidon's loyalties shifted with his moods and grievances, while Ares delighted in the bloodshed regardless of its ultimate outcome. Only Zeus attempted to maintain some measure of balance, though even his efforts were complicated by his own divided sympathies and the pressure from his divine family. The intervention of the gods transformed individual battles into cosmic struggles, with mortal warriors serving as pawns in conflicts that reached far beyond the walls of Troy. When a hero fell in battle, it was often unclear whether his death resulted from enemy skill, divine intervention, or simple mortal chance. This uncertainty added a psychological dimension to the war that was perhaps even more devastating than its physical casualties, as warriors on both sides struggled to understand their role in a conflict that seemed to transcend human comprehension. As you drift deeper into sleep's embrace, let your mind wander through those ancient battlefields where bronze met bronze under skies that flickered with divine lightning. The clash of armies becomes a distant thunder, the cries of warriors fade to whispers, and the great siege settles into the rhythm of waves against an eternal shore, where mortal ambitions dissolve into the larger patterns of fate and destiny. The turning point in the war's long stalemate came through an unexpected source: Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion and beloved friend. As the Greek situation became increasingly desperate, with Trojan forces actually threatening to burn their ships and cut off all hope of escape, Patroclus could no longer bear to watch his countrymen suffer while his friend nursed his wounded pride. He approached Achilles with a proposal that would honour the young hero's grievances while still providing aid to their struggling comrades. Patroclus requested permission to enter battle wearing Achilles' distinctive armour, hoping that the sight of the famous panoply would inspire the Greeks and terrify the Trojans into retreating. The plan had sound psychological foundations, for Achilles' armour was as recognisable as his face, and many warriors on both sides would assume that the great hero had returned to battle. Achilles, moved by his friend's arguments and his own growing concern for the Greek army's fate, agreed to the deception, but warned Patroclus to limit his objectives to driving the Trojans back from the ships rather than pursuing a more ambitious assault. The appearance of what seemed to be Achilles on the battlefield had exactly the effect that Patroclus had hoped for. Greek morale soared as word spread that their greatest champion had returned to the fight, while Trojan confidence faltered at the prospect of facing the warrior they had learned to fear above all others. Patroclus, fighting with desperate courage and inspired by wearing his hero's gear, led a charge that pushed the Trojans back from the Greek ships and seemed to offer hope for breaking the siege entirely. But success bred overconfidence, and Patroclus forgot his friend's warnings in the excitement of apparent victory. Instead of being content with saving the ships, he pressed his attack toward Troy's walls, hoping to achieve the glory that had so long eluded the Greek army. His advance was checked by Apollo himself, who struck the hero with divine force and left him stunned and vulnerable on the battlefield, his borrowed armour scattered around him like the fragments of a broken dream. Hector, recognizing that this was not truly Achilles, but rather an impostor whose identity he had penetrated, moved in for the kill. Patroclus, stripped of his divine protection and still reeling from Apollo's assault, could offer little resistance as the Trojan prince's spear found its mark. With his dying breath, Patroclus prophesied that Hector's own death would soon follow. But the Trojan hero was too caught up in the moment of triumph to heed the warning of a dying enemy. The death of Patroclus shattered Achilles' world like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. All the anger he had felt toward Agamemnon, all the pride that had kept him from the fighting, all the careful calculation of honour and obligation that had guided his actions, everything was swept away by a grief so profound that it seemed to reach into the very foundations of his being. The loss of his dearest friend transformed Achilles from a proud young warrior, nursing wounded feelings, into something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The physical manifestations of Achilles' grief were as dramatic as its emotional impact. He rolled in the dust and ashes of his campfire, tearing his hair and clothing while crying out his anguish to the uncaring sky. His myrmidons, shocked by their leader's transformation, could only watch as the invincible hero they had followed to Troy dissolved into raw human pain. Even the horses that pulled his war chariot wept, shedding tears that crystallized into pearls as they touched the earth. Thetis, hearing her son's cries from her palace beneath the sea, rose from the depths to comfort him, bringing with her the sea nymphs who served as her attendants. But even divine consolation could not ease Achilles' pain, for he now understood with terrible clarity that his friend's death was the direct result of his own prideful withdrawal from battle. Had he been fighting alongside the Greeks, instead of sulking in his tent, Patroclus would never have needed to borrow his armour, and the deception that led to tragedy would never have been attempted. The reconciliation between Achilles and Agamemnon that followed was as swift as it was complete. Faced with his hero's overwhelming grief and rage, the Greek commander offered not only the return of Odysseus, but additional gifts and honours that far exceeded the value of the original dispute. But Achilles brushed aside all talk of compensation and prizes. for material rewards had lost all meaning in the face of his personal loss. Only one thing could ease his pain: the death of Hector in payment for Patroclus' life. The forging of new armour for Achilles became an event of cosmic significance, for his mother commissioned Hephaestus himself, the divine smith, to create weapons worthy of the vengeance that was to come. Working through the night in his forge beneath Mount Etna, the god crafted not merely armour, but works of art that captured the entire cosmos in their decoration. The shield alone was a masterpiece that depicted the full range of human experience, from peaceful cities to raging battlefields, from wedding celebrations to funeral processions, from the harmony of the seasons to the eternal dance of the stars. When Achilles donned his new panoply and prepared to return to battle, he was transformed into something more than human. The divine armour seemed to lift him above mortal limitations, while his rage burned with such intensity that it created its own light, making him visible from great distances like a beacon of war. The very ground trembled beneath his feet as he strode toward his chariot, and both Greeks and Trojans fell silent at the sight of this terrible figure preparing for combat. The battle that followed Achilles' return was unlike anything the war had yet produced. The Greek hero fought with a fury that transcended normal human limitations, cutting through Trojan ranks like a force of nature rather than a mortal warrior. His spear never missed its mark, his sword never dulled, and his presence on the battlefield seemed to bend reality itself around his will for vengeance. Warriors who had fought bravely against other opponents fled in terror at his approach, while those who stood to face him were swept away like leaves before a hurricane. The Trojans, who had grown confident during Achilles' absence, found themselves driven back toward their city walls in complete disorder. Heroes who had won renown in previous fighting fell before Achilles' advance like wheat before the scythe. Their names added to the growing tally of his vengeance. Even the gods themselves seemed powerless to stop his rampage, for Zeus had decreed that this day belonged to the son of Thetis, and no divine intervention would be permitted to cheat him of his revenge. As the night deepens around you and sleep draws nearer, let the ancient fury of Achilles carry you toward peaceful rest. His rage burns like a distant star, beautiful and terrible in its intensity, yet growing more distant with each breath, as the mortal world fades into the realm of dreams. The climactic duel between Achilles and Hector took place before the walls of Troy, witnessed by both armies and the gods themselves. Hector, knowing that his death was foreordained yet unable to abandon his duty to his city and family, had spent the morning in prayer and preparation, saying farewell to his wife Andromache and his infant son Astyanax. The Trojan prince understood that he was going to his doom, but his honour as a warrior and his love for Troy left him no choice but to face the Greek champion in single combat. The pursuit that preceded their final confrontation was both magnificent and heartbreaking. 3 times Hector ran around the walls of Troy with Achilles in pursuit, neither man able to gain advantage over the other in speed or endurance. The Trojans watched from their battlements as their greatest hero sought some stratagem that might allow him to survive the encounter, while the Greeks cheered their champion's relentless pursuit. The gods themselves were divided, some supporting Hector's courage, while others applauded Achilles' righteous vengeance. When the two heroes finally faced each other in combat, the duel was brief but decisive. Hector fought with all the skill and courage that had made him the bulwark of Troy's defence, but he was facing an opponent who had transcended normal human limitations through grief and divine favour. Achilles' spear, guided by both superhuman skill and godly assistance, found the one vulnerable spot in Hector's armour, and the Trojan prince fell with a wound that would have killed any mortal man instantly. But Achilles' vengeance did not end with Hector's death. Consumed by rage and grief that had not been satisfied by victory, he dragged his enemy's body behind his chariot around the walls of Troy, defiling the corpse in a display that shocked even his own allies. For 12 days he continued this ritual humiliation, driving his chariot around Patroclus's funeral pyre, while Hector's body bounced and scraped across the rocky ground, an act that violated every norm of civilized warfare. The gods themselves were appalled by this excessive display of wrath. Apollo, who had favoured Troy throughout the war, protected Hector's body from decay and disfigurement, while other deities debated intervention. Finally, Zeus himself commanded that the desecration must end, sending word to Achilles through his mother Thetis that he must accept ransom for Hector's body and allow the Trojans to perform proper funeral rites for their fallen hero. The meeting between Priam and Achilles that resulted from this divine command became one of the war's most moving episodes. The aged king of Troy, setting aside all royal dignity and personal safety, came alone to the Greek camp under cover of darkness, bearing rich gifts and trusting in the sacred bonds of supplication to protect him. When he knelt before Achilles and kissed the hands that had killed his son, both men were moved to tears by the common humanity that transcended their roles as enemies. In that tent beside the wine-dark sea, two broken men found temporary peace in shared grief. Priam wept for Hector and for the doom that he now saw clearly awaiting his city, while Achilles mourned not only for Patroclus but for his own father Peleus, whom he would never see again, and for the brief life that awaited him. They ate together and spoke of their losses, finding in that moment a connection that war had made impossible, but sorrow had created. The funeral of Hector became a respite from warfare that both sides desperately needed. For 9 days, Troy mourned its greatest hero with ceremonies that drew participants from across the known world. Kings and commoners alike paid their respects to the prince who had embodied the best virtues of his age, while poets composed verses that would carry his memory down through the generations. Even the Greeks observed the truce with respect, recognizing in their enemy's grief a reflection of their own losses. But the war's momentum could not be stopped by grief alone. New allies arrived to support Troy in its hour of greatest need, bringing with them hope that the city might yet survive despite Hector's death. From the lands beyond the sunrise came Memnon, prince of Ethiopia, leading an army of warriors whose bronze armor had been darkened by the desert sun. His arrival brought not only military strength, but renewed confidence, for Memnon was said to be a son of Eos, the goddess of dawn, and his divine parentage gave him powers that rivaled those of the greatest Greek heroes. The duel between Achilles and Memnon became another pivotal moment in the war's final phase. Both warriors possessed divine ancestry and superhuman abilities, making their combat a clash between equals rather than the one-sided contest that had characterized most of Achilles' recent battles. They fought for hours, without either gaining decisive advantage, their bronze weapons ringing like bells as they struck and parried, their movements too swift for ordinary mortals to follow clearly. In the end, Achilles' experience and the quality of his divine armor proved decisive, but Memnon's death came only after he had demonstrated courage and skill that won the respect of both armies. His fall marked the end of Troy's last hope for a champion who might match the Greek hero in single combat, leaving the defenders to rely on collective strength and defensive tactics rather than individual prowess. The arrival of Penthesilea and her Amazon warriors provided Troy with another brief resurgence of hope, though it too would end in tragedy. The Amazon queen was a daughter of Ares himself, trained from birth in the arts of war and leading a contingent of warrior women whose skills had become legendary throughout the ancient world. Their exotic fighting style and fearless courage initially confounded the Greeks, who had little experience facing female opponents in formal battle. Penthesilea's death at Achilles' hands became the source of one of the war's most poignant moments. As the life faded from her eyes, Achilles saw past her warrior's mask to the woman beneath, and was struck by her beauty and courage in a way that filled him with unexpected grief. Some said that he fell in love with her in that instant of victory, while others claimed that he wept for the waste of such a magnificent life. Either way, his reaction to her death showed that even his grief-hardened heart could still be moved by beauty and valor. The death of Achilles himself came not long after these victories, fulfilling the prophecies that had long foretold his early doom. Paris, guided by Apollo and seeking to avenge his brother Hector, loosed an arrow that found the one vulnerable spot in the Greek hero's divine armor, his heel, where his mother Thetis had held him when she dipped him in the waters of the river Styx. The wound was small, but it carried divine poison that no mortal healing could cure, and the greatest warrior of his generation died as the sun set over the Trojan plain. The contest for Achilles' armor became a political crisis that nearly shattered the Greek coalition. Both Ajax and Odysseus claimed the right to inherit the fallen hero's divine panoply, each presenting arguments based on their service to the common cause and their relationship with the deceased. When the army's leaders awarded the armor to Odysseus, recognizing his intellectual contributions as more valuable than Ajax's purely martial prowess, the decision created a rift that would have lasting consequences for the Greek cause. Ajax's response to this perceived slight revealed the psychological toll that the long war had taken on even its strongest participants. The great warrior, who had served as the army's defensive backbone for nearly a decade, fell into a madness that led him to attack a flock of sheep in the belief that they were his enemies. When sanity returned and he realized what he had done, shame drove him to suicide, depriving the Greeks of another irreplaceable hero just when they could least afford the loss. As you drift deeper into sleep's peaceful embrace, let these ancient sorrows fade into the gentle rhythm of waves against a distant shore. The great heroes sleep now in their eternal rest, their struggles dissolved into the larger patterns of time and memory, their pain transformed into the timeless stories that comfort and inspire generations yet unborn. The war entered its final phase as both sides struggled to maintain their strength despite mounting losses. The Greeks had lost their greatest warriors, while Troy's resources were exhausted by years of siege and the cost of supporting allied armies. Yet neither side could abandon the struggle that had consumed so much of their blood and treasure, for the stakes had grown beyond the original quarrel over Helen to encompass the honor and survival of entire civilizations. It was during this period of mutual exhaustion that Odysseus conceived the stratagem that would finally break the deadlock. The idea came to him in a dream, though whether it was sent by Athena or born from his own desperate creativity remained unclear. Rather than continuing the frontal assaults that had failed for so many years, the Greeks would appear to abandon the siege while secretly leaving behind a weapon that would open Troy's gates from within. The construction of the Trojan horse became a project that engaged the skills of the entire Greek army. Epius, the finest craftsman among the coalition forces, directed the building of a hollow wooden horse, large enough to conceal a select group of warriors, while appearing to be a religious offering worthy of the gods. The work proceeded in secret, with only a few trusted leaders knowing the true purpose of what appeared to be an elaborate sculpture. The horse itself was a masterpiece of both artistry and engineering. Crafted from the finest timber and adorned with precious metals and intricate carvings, it appeared to be a magnificent offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare. Its hollow interior was carefully designed to accommodate armed warriors while providing them with enough air and space to remain hidden for extended periods. Every detail was planned to deceive the Trojans into believing they were receiving a genuine religious artifact rather than an instrument of war. The selection of the warriors who would hide within the horse was made with careful attention to both courage and cunning. Odysseus himself would lead the group, along with Menelaus, whose personal stake in the war's outcome made his participation symbolically important. Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, was included both for his inherited martial prowess and to represent the new generation of heroes. Other volunteers came from across the Greek coalition, each chosen for specific skills that might prove valuable once they emerged inside Troy's walls. The apparent Greek withdrawal was staged with meticulous attention to detail. The entire army packed their belongings and loaded their ships as if preparing for a permanent departure, leaving behind only the horse and a carefully selected Greek soldier named Sinon, who would pose as a deserter and convince the Trojans to bring the horse inside their city. The fleet then sailed away to a hidden anchorage behind the nearby island of Tenedos, where they would wait for the signal to return. Sinon's performance as a deserter was crucial to the plan's success. Captured by Trojan patrols as he wandered near the abandoned Greek camp, he spun a tale of persecution and betrayal that was designed to win Trojan sympathy while explaining the horse's presence. According to his story, the Greeks had built the horse as an offering to Athena to ensure their safe voyage home, making it deliberately large so that the Trojans could not bring it inside their city and claim the goddess's protection for themselves. The debate that followed within Troy's walls revealed the divisions that years of war had created among the city's leadership. Laocoon, the priest of Apollo, warned against accepting any gift from the Greeks, famously declaring that he feared Greeks even when bearing gifts. His suspicions were shared by Cassandra, the prophetic daughter of Priam, whose warnings about the horse's true nature were dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman, a fate that had befallen all her prophecies since Apollo had cursed her gift of foresight. But other voices argued for accepting the horse as a sign that the gods had finally turned against the Greeks and granted Troy victory. After so many years of suffering and sacrifice, the Trojans were eager to believe that their trials were ending, and that the magnificent horse represented divine approval of their cause. The desire for the war to be over, combined with Sinon's convincing deception, overcame the warnings of those who counseled caution. The decision to bring the horse inside Troy's walls required significant engineering efforts, for the structure was too large to pass through the city's gates. Sections of the wall had to be dismantled to create an opening wide enough for the horse to pass through, a task that required hours of labour and created a symbolic breach in the defences that had protected Troy for so many years. As the horse was dragged through the streets on rollers, crowds gathered to marvel at this apparent trophy of their victory over the Greek invaders. The celebration that followed the horse's installation within Troy was the most joyous the city had experienced since before the war began. Wine flowed freely through the streets as citizens and soldiers alike participated in festivities that lasted deep into the night. The long years of rationing and vigilance were temporarily forgotten as Troy allowed itself to believe that the nightmare of siege and battle had finally ended with their triumph. But as the city slept off its celebrations, the hidden Greeks emerged from their wooden concealment like deadly shadows. Moving silently through Troy's darkened streets, they overcame the few sentries who remained at their posts and opened the city's gates to admit their comrades, who had returned under cover of darkness from their hiding place behind Tenedos. The attack that followed was swift and devastating, catching the Trojans completely unprepared for battle in their own homes. The sack of Troy that ensued was one of the most brutal episodes in the entire war, as years of pent-up frustration and anger exploded into an orgy of violence and destruction. Greek warriors, who had spent a decade trying to break through Troy's defences, now found themselves free to rampage through the city's streets, driven by a mixture of vengeance, greed, and the simple release of finally achieving their long-sought goal. King Priam met his end at the altar of Zeus, struck down by Neoptolemus as he sought sanctuary in the sacred precinct. The young warrior's killing of the aged king violated every norm of civilized warfare, but the heat of battle and the memory of his father's death had stripped away all restraint. With Priam's death, the royal line of Troy was effectively ended, and the city's political structure collapsed into chaos. The fate of Troy's royal family epitomized the tragedy that engulfed the entire city. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the city's walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father, while Polyxena, Priam's daughter, was sacrificed at Achilles' tomb to honor the dead hero's memory. Cassandra was claimed as a prize by Agamemnon, though her prophetic gifts would soon bring doom to her captor as well. Helen herself, the woman whose beauty had launched 1,000 ships and caused the deaths of countless heroes, was found in Paris's palace and reclaimed by Menelaus. The reunion between husband and wife was complex, mixing relief at her recovery with the bitter memory of all that her abduction had cost. Some accounts suggest that Menelaus initially intended to kill her for her betrayal, but her beauty and his own love proved stronger than his desire for revenge. As you settle deeper into peaceful sleep, let the flames that consumed ancient Troy fade into the gentle glow of distant stars. The great city's destruction becomes a distant memory, no more substantial than shadows on a wall, while the eternal rhythm of sea and sky carries away the pain of mortal ambition and divine wrath. The destruction of Troy marked not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter in the epic tale. For the victorious Greeks would discover that their triumph carried with it a curse that would follow them across the wine-dark sea to their distant homes. The gods who had allowed Troy's fall were not finished with the mortals who had served as their instruments, and the homeward journey would prove as perilous as the war itself had been. Agamemnon's return to Mycenae should have been a moment of supreme triumph, the vindication of years of struggle and sacrifice. He had led the greatest military expedition in history to victory against impossible odds, recovering Helen and avenging the insult to Greek honor that had started the war. His ships were loaded with treasure beyond counting, his reputation was secure for all time, and his position as the paramount king of Greece seemed unassailable. But Clytemnestra had not spent the war years in idle waiting. The death of Iphigenia had planted a seed of hatred in her heart that grew stronger with each passing season, fed by grief and nurtured by a desire for justice that had slowly transformed into an implacable thirst for revenge. During Agamemnon's absence, she had taken Aegisthus as her lover, a man who had his own reasons for hating the house of Atreus and was eager to help her plan her husband's destruction. The murder of Agamemnon in his own palace was carefully orchestrated to appear as a crime of passion, the result of a wife's justified anger at her husband's infidelity. For Agamemnon had brought with him from Troy not only treasure, but a concubine, Cassandra, the prophetic daughter of Priam, whose warnings about the doom awaiting them went unheeded as always. Clytemnestra struck down both her husband and his captive lover, claiming the deed as righteous vengeance for Iphigenia's death. The cycle of vengeance that had driven the Trojan War now turned inward upon the Greek royal houses, as the sins of one generation demanded payment from the next. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, would eventually return to avenge his father's murder by killing his own mother, perpetuating a cycle of blood guilt that seemed to have no natural end. The victory over Troy had solved nothing fundamental about human nature or divine justice. It had merely transferred the arena of conflict from the plains of Asia to the palaces of Greece. Menelaus's homeward journey with Helen became an odyssey of its own, though less famous than that of his companion Odysseus. Driven off course by divine winds and mortal storms, the Spartan king and his recovered wife wandered the Mediterranean for years, visiting Egypt and other distant lands before finally returning to their kingdom. Their marriage, tested by war and separation, somehow survived the trials that had destroyed so many other relationships, though it was forever marked by the memory of all that Helen's beauty had cost. But it was Odysseus whose homeward journey became the most celebrated of all the post-war adventures, a 10-year odyssey that matched the duration of the siege itself and provided material for countless retellings. The king of Ithaca, whose cunning had devised the stratagem that won the war, found himself beset by divine opposition that seemed determined to prevent his return to his island kingdom and his faithful wife, Penelope. Poseidon's enmity toward Odysseus stemmed from the hero's blinding of Polyphemus, the god's Cyclops' son, during his wanderings. This act of violence, committed in self-defense but accompanied by a boastful revelation of his true identity, brought down upon Odysseus the wrath of the Earthshaker, who commanded storms and sea monsters to delay the hero's homecoming. For 10 long years, Odysseus struggled against divine opposition, his small fleet gradually whittled away until he alone survived to reach his native shores. The adventures that befell Odysseus during his wanderings became legends in their own right, each encounter revealing different aspects of the hero's character and the dangerous wonders of the ancient world. From the lotus eaters who offered forgetfulness of all troubles to the sirens whose songs promised knowledge at the cost of life, from the witch Circe who transformed men into beasts to the goddess Calypso who offered immortality for love, each episode tested Odysseus's resolve to return home to his mortal life and responsibilities. The hero's eventual return to Ithaca revealed how the war's effects had spread far beyond the battlefield. His palace was overrun with suitors seeking to marry Penelope and claim his kingdom, believing that he must surely be dead after so many years of absence. These men had consumed his wealth, abused his hospitality, and plotted to murder his son Telemachus, transforming his home into a battlefield where the final act of the Trojan War would be played out. The slaughter of the suitors that climaxed Odysseus's homecoming was as brutal and decisive as the sack of Troy itself. Using the bow that only he could string, the returning king systematically eliminated every man who had threatened his family and usurped his position, showing no mercy to those who had presumed to steal what was rightfully his. The blood that flowed in his own hall was the final payment for the war that had begun with Helen's abduction so many years before. Yet even this violence did not truly end the story, for the families of the dead suitors demanded their own vengeance, threatening to perpetuate the cycle of bloodshed indefinitely. Only the intervention of Athena herself, speaking with the voice of Zeus, finally brought peace to Ithaca and closure to the long chain of consequences that had flowed from Paris's judgment on Mount Ida. As the night grows deeper around you and dreams draw ever closer, let these ancient stories settle into the peaceful rhythm of your breathing. The heroes of Troy and Greece have found their rest at last, their struggles transformed into the timeless tales that comfort us in our own journey through life's mysteries and challenges. The legacy of the Trojan War extended far beyond the immediate participants, shaping the cultural and political development of the ancient world for centuries to come. The epic poems that preserved its memory became the foundation of Western literature, providing models of heroism, tragedy, and human excellence that would inspire countless generations of poets, warriors, and philosophers. The values embodied by heroes like Hector and Achilles, honor, loyalty, courage in the face of certain death, became ideals that defined aristocratic culture throughout the ancient Mediterranean. The war's impact on trade and commerce was equally profound, for Troy's destruction removed one of the ancient world's most important commercial centers and shifted the balance of economic power toward the Greek mainland and islands. The routes that had carried precious goods between Europe and Asia were disrupted, forcing merchants to develop new pathways and creating opportunities for different cities and kingdoms to rise to prominence. The religious implications of the war's outcome were complex and far-reaching. The Greek victories seemed to validate their pantheon of gods and their understanding of divine justice, yet the sufferings that befell the victors suggested that the gods' favor was neither permanent nor easily understood. The stories of divine intervention and mortal hubris that emerged from the war became central to Greek religious thought, influencing how they understood the relationship between human ambition and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from sites across the eastern Mediterranean reveals the widespread destruction that marked the end of the Bronze Age, suggesting that the Trojan War may have been part of a larger pattern of conflict and collapse that affected many ancient civilizations. The Sea Peoples who ravaged the coasts during this period, the fall of the Hittite Empire, the decline of Mycenaean civilization, all these events were interconnected parts of a broader transformation that reshaped the ancient world. The historical Troy, revealed through decades of careful excavation, shows evidence of destruction and rebuilding that matches many details preserved in the epic tradition. While we cannot definitively identify specific individuals or events mentioned in the poems, the archaeological record confirms that a great city did exist at the traditional site of Troy, that it was wealthy and powerful, and that it was destroyed by warfare during the period when the legendary conflict was supposed to have taken place. The enduring appeal of the Trojan War stories lies not in their historical accuracy, but in their psychological and emotional truth. The conflicts between duty and desire, honor and survival, love and loyalty that drive the narrative remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. The heroes and heroines of Troy speak to something universal in human experience, embodying our highest aspirations and our deepest fears, in forms that transcend the specific circumstances of their ancient world. As you drift into sleep's peaceful embrace, let these timeless themes carry you toward rest. The great stories that began beside the walls of Troy continue to unfold in every human heart, where courage and cowardice, love and hate, hope and despair play out their eternal drama against the backdrop of time's endless flow. The transformation of the Trojan War from historical event to cultural touchstone began almost immediately after its conclusion, as poets and storytellers throughout the ancient world seized upon its rich material to create works that would outlive the civilizations that produced them. The oral tradition that preserved these stories for centuries before they were written down ensured that each generation could find in them reflections of their own struggles and values, adapting the ancient tales to speak to contemporary concerns while preserving their essential power. The influence of the Trojan War stories spread far beyond the Greek-speaking world, as other cultures adapted and transformed the basic narrative to fit their own mythological and historical frameworks. Roman poets like Virgil used the war as a starting point for their own national epic, tracing the journey of Aeneas from Troy's ruins to the founding of Rome itself. This connection between Troy's fall and Rome's rise gave the Romans a sense of cosmic destiny, suggesting that the destruction of one great civilization had been necessary for the birth of another. Medieval European culture found in the Trojan War stories a mirror for their own values of chivalry and courtly love, transforming the Bronze Age warriors into knights errant and their conflicts into romantic adventures. The matter of Troy became one of the great literary cycles of the Middle Ages, alongside the Arthurian legends and the stories of Charlemagne, providing poets and audiences with a shared vocabulary of heroic ideals and tragic consequences. The Renaissance rediscovered the classical versions of the Trojan War stories, finding in them both artistic inspiration and philosophical depth that spoke to the humanistic values of the age. Artists and writers from Homer's time forward had used these stories to explore fundamental questions about fate and free will, the nature of honor, the price of glory, and the relationship between individual desires and social obligations. Each age found different answers to these eternal questions while recognizing their continuing relevance. Modern scholarship has approached the Trojan War from multiple perspectives, using archaeology, linguistics, comparative mythology, and historical analysis to understand both the possible reality behind the legends and the process by which that reality was transformed into enduring art. While we may never know exactly what happened on the plains of Troy 3 millennia ago, we can appreciate how the stories that grew from those events continue to illuminate the human condition with undiminished power. The psychological insights embedded in these ancient narratives remain remarkably sophisticated, anticipating discoveries about human nature that would not be formally articulated until the development of modern psychology. The complex motivations of characters like Achilles, whose rage stems from wounded pride but is sustained by genuine grief, or Helen, whose beauty becomes both blessing and curse, reveal an understanding of human complexity that transcends the specific cultural context in which these stories were created. The political dimensions of the Trojan War continue to resonate in an age when conflicts between civilizations and the collision of different value systems remain central concerns. The war between East and West that began with Paris's judgment has been replayed countless times throughout history, as cultures with different understandings of honor, justice, and proper social order have come into conflict with consequences that ripple across generations. As the final threads of this ancient tapestry weave themselves into the peaceful fabric of your dreams, remember that every ending is also a beginning. The fall of Troy marked not just the conclusion of one story, but the commencement of countless others. As the survivors of that great conflagration carried their experiences into new lands and new lives, planting seeds that would grow into the civilizations we know today. The eternal themes that emerged from the ashes of Troy, the price of beauty, the weight of honor, the bonds of loyalty, the inevitability of change, continue to shape human experience across cultures and centuries. In every age, new Achilles and Hectors arise to face their own tests of courage and character. New Helens discover the double-edged nature of exceptional gifts. New Odysseus's begin long journeys home to the people and places they love. Let sleep now carry you across the wine-dark sea of memory to shores where ancient stories merge with personal dreams, where the heroes of Troy join the heroes of your own life in the timeless realm where all struggles find their resolution and all journeys reach their destined end. In that peaceful kingdom beyond the reach of time and change, may you find the rest that even the greatest warriors finally earn, and the understanding that transforms suffering into wisdom, conflict into peace, and endings into eternal beginnings.